Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. I'm your humble servant, Mr. Smith, with another piece of unplugged wisdom, with the purpose in mind to enlighten you and hopefully get you out of some of your mental cages, if you will. So let's talk more about the Beatles, right? The iconic band, the Beatles. Oh, they were just so life-changing and peace and love and all this stuff. And their music was so deep. But I proposed the possibility that they were one of the first boy bands. We know from Quincy Jones and from a great drummer named Bernard Purdie that Ringo Starr didn't record the drums, at least on the first few Beatle albums. Maybe he did later, and we talked about why that is. Me being a musician myself, I know it is much different recording your instrument in the studio, especially drums, than playing live. When you record in the studio, every note has to be just in the pocket, and every nuance has to be right. You have to hit the cymbals just right so they don't overpower the mics. And that usually requires a much higher level of musicianship that doesn't come to a lot of musicians until they're in their, well, it depends on when they started playing their instrument, but at least not until their mid to late 20s. So, there you go with that. Also, we know that the original Paul McCartney died in a car crash in 1966 and was replaced by Billy Sheeran, who was a musician in his own right and strangely disappeared, didn't make any more music, and strangely disappeared as of 1967. And it is pretty established that he is the second Paul McCartney and still is doing music and making celebrity appearances as Paul McCartney to this day. I mean, who knows? His legal name probably is Paul McCartney, so he can say, yeah, I'm Paul McCartney. And that gives us a big piece of evidence that the Beatles were a boy band created at a place called the Tavistock Institute. We'll get into that in just a minute. When the first Paul McCartney died, they needed to replace him because the Beatles were such a huge success financially and social engineering wise. As you're going to see in a minute, popular music is created not just to sell and make money, but also to socially engineer. As I'm going to start saying in a lot of my videos, when the elites or the powers that be, whatever you want to call them, when they do things, there's always the low-level reason. There's always a few reasons, right? The low-level reason is money. The high-level reason is more spiritual / biblical, right? So music creation is a cash cow, of course. That's why they do it, to make money. And there's a higher level spiritual reason, which we will start uncovering as we do this, as we do lessons like this. So enough waffling. Let's begin. That's my reference to Replicant Fish with a PH. Definitely check out his channel. Anyway, so let's begin. Who is this handsome fellow on the screen here? That is Theodor Adorno. He is the man that allegedly wrote most of the Beatles songs. He was born in 1903. And by the time the Beatles came along, obviously he was in his 50s, 60s. He was a master musician, but as we'll find out, he seemed to be more interested in manipulating people with music than the music itself. So we're going to look into Theodor Adorno. Now, I think I mentioned this before, But one of the biggest smoking guns, as they say, about Theodor Adorno writing the Beatles songs is that, ready? When Michael Jackson bought the Beatles songs, he bought them from the Theodor Adorno estate. What? Goes right over people's heads. Actually, I don't think most people really cared. Now, you got to remember, back in the 60s, when the Beatles were created, early 60s, they could get away with stuff like this, right? There wasn't social media, internet, there wasn't cell phones everywhere, people taking pictures of everything. People weren't recording every little detail like they are today. So when the first Paul McCartney died, it was relatively easy just to slip in the second guy. And, because all people saw were posters and occasionally pictures on the news. So, just went right over, went right by people. And, we know the powers that be lie. They lie all the time. So why not just lie and tell you that, oh, yeah, the Beatles wrote this song, or Lennon wrote this song, or Lennon and McCartney wrote this song, when it was really Theodor Adorno. Now, we're going to look at some stuff about Theodor Adorno. Okay, and first of all, let's start with good old Wikipedia. Okay, what do they have to say about Theodor Adorno? And when I went to Wikipedia, and feel free to look it up, Theodor Adorno, Adorno. The Wikipedia page on his bio was so long and it was so wordy, I started to get the feeling that they really didn't want you to know the truth about this guy, because it was so wordy and it didn't make a lot of sense. Anytime they use big words and stuff, and it just, and they over intellectualize things, good chance they're just trying to get you to give up doing your research. They're like, whatever, blah. Or they want you to feel stupid, or they just don't want you to really understand what things are really about. So, what we're going to do is we're going to look at some things that were mentioned in Wikipedia. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. It was really, really long. But we're going to look at some choice things about Theodor Adorno. So, to give you a taste. And of course, feel free to go to Wikipedia yourself on this. So, here we go. Okay. Well, the first thing I noticed on Wikipedia was he was born in 1903. Here's an interesting fact. His father was an assimilated Jewish person, otherwise known as a crypto-Jewish person. That means they hide the fact they're Jewish and assimilate to another culture like Roman Catholicism or they become a Methodist and they go to your local Methodist church, but they hide the fact that they practice Judaism. I just found that very interesting. The other thing that was interesting about when you read on Wikipedia about Adorno, he easily moved. Right, he's German, but he easily moved to L.A. and he moved into Pacific Palisades, which is a choice upscale neighborhood in L.A. near the beach. If I had a neighborhood to live in L.A., that would be the one. But I don't have that kind of money. Anyway, so he easily moved to L.A. and moved around, and then he, of course, ended up in England at working at the Tavistock Institute. He also worked at something called the Frankfurt School, which is aligned with the Tavistock Institute. And they do sociological experiments there, social engineering experiments. So this guy was really into manipulating people and manipulating the masses. Okay? On Wikipedia, it also admits that Adorno liked Marxism. Hegel, if you don't know who Hegel is, right? Hegel, H-E-G-E-L. Hegel is venerated, I think that's the right word, meaning kind of idolized by people like in Masonry and stuff like that. Hegel created what is called the Hegelian dialectic, where they create the problem and then they come in with the solution, right? Or it can also be interpreted, the Hegelian dialectic, as they control both sides of the issue. They control, for example, both the Republicans and Democrats. He also liked Freud. We know we get into Sigmund Freud, who did a lot of coke, and Sigmund Freud's research was also used to manipulate people and sell people products. So Adorno was into all this stuff. Now, he's a master musician, but he criticized jazz. That's interesting. I mean, jazz might not be your cup of tea, but if you are a musician, you should appreciate it. But he criticized it. And he also criticized pop music, viewing it as, quote, culture industry, meaning pop music shapes the culture. Okay? And also, at the end of the Wikipedia article, it mentions musical works that he wrote. For example, a lot of short piano and voice pieces, which can easily be converted to guitar riffs, bass lines, and then therefore into pop songs, right? One thing, if you guys are young out there, any young people, young musicians, or if you're parents and you want to get your kids into music, I highly recommend you start them off on piano. Because piano has everything: bass line, melody, harmony, rhythm, right? They can learn all the basics of musicianship starting off on keyboard or piano. And then if your son or daughter or you yourself have a particular instrument you want to become really, really good at, then you can switch to that. And it will be an easy transition. Anyway, so clearly, even though nobody knows who this Adorno guy is, Wikipedia is telling us that he's quite the musician and artist. And overwhelmingly, as we're going to see, we're going to look at some choice pieces from Wikipedia that I'm going to put on the screen. He clearly was into manipulating people through music. It seemed to be his passion. So let's take a look at this first clip from Wikipedia. See what it says. Okay, here's a clip on the screen from Adorno's Wikipedia. It says, even a fellow Marxist, such as the historian and jazz critic Eric Hobsbawm, saw Adorno's writings as containing, quote, some of the stupidest pages ever written about jazz, unquote. Boy, he really hated jazz. The British philosopher Roger Scruton saw Adorno as producing, quote, reams of turgid nonsense devoted to showing that the American people are just as alienated as Marxism requires them to be, and that their cheerful, life-affirming music is a, quote, fetishized commodity. That last quote is very interesting. This guy says Adorno produces turgid nonsense devoted to showing that the American people are alienated, stupid, and their life-affirming music is a fetishized commodity. So he's saying Adorno writes this life-affirming music that is a fetishized commodity. I mean, read that quote again when you get a chance. It really says a lot. Let's move on to the next one. Let's see what it says here. The 5 components of recognition. Adorno states that a start to understand the recognition and respect of any particular song, hit, may be made by drafting a scheme which divides the experience of recognition into its different components. All the factors people enumerate are interwoven to a degree that would be impossible to separate from one another in reality. Adorno's scheme is directed towards the different objective elements involved in the experience of recognition. than the actual experience felt for the individual. Number 1, vague remembrance. 2, actual identification. 3, subsumption by label. 4, self-reflection and active recognition. 5, psychological transfer of recognition authority to the object.
What the hell is that?
That's what I meant about this over-intellectualization. Okay, but here's the point that I'm trying to make about this thing, the 5 components of recognition, this quote that's on the screen, and that was in the Wikipedia bio. Adorno states that a start to understand the recognition in respect of any particular song hit. All right, so this guy is totally into writing hits. And in his over-intellectualized way, he is really thinking hard. He's going hard to try to get people psychologically manipulated by these song hits. So here's the overall point. Wikipedia is basically telling you that this guy is really into writing song hits. So more evidence that he did write hit songs. Okay? Let's go on to the next quote. They do this, as mentioned above, by individualizing products to give the illusion to consumers that they are in fact purchasing a product or service that was specifically designed for them. Adorno highlights the issues created with the construction of popular music, where different samples of music used in the creation of today's chart-topping songs are put together in order to create, recreate, and modify numerous tracks by using the same variety of samples from one song to another. He makes a distinction between apologetic music and critical music. Apologetic music is defined as the highly produced and promoted music of the pop music industry. Music that is composed of variable parts and interchanged to create several different songs. The social and psychological functions of popular music are that it acts like a social cement to keep people obedient and subservient to the status quo of existing power structures. End quote. That's an Adorno quote. Isn't it interesting? That was written in the 60s, maybe 50s, because you got to remember Adorno died, I believe, in 1968 or 9. But this is still used today. All pop music, all the hip hop and stuff like that, it's just interchangeable beats, and they just rearrange the parts, and you got a totally different song. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's an art and a craft to doing that, but it is interesting that back in the 60s, Adorno was talking about this. So this guy's no joke. I mean, he not only studies, and he was in his 50s and 60s when the Beatles were around. So if he allegedly wrote their songs, he was, a master at that point, by that point. And most likely, he had those songs written in the 50s on piano, and they just, adapted them, whatever you want to say, to guitar, bass, right? And then they had the harmonies, right? All worked out. So this guy is no joke. All right, so you can read that, and this is, again, in his bio on Wikipedia. But what's creepy is he says, to keep people obedient and subservient to the status quo of existing power structures. Right? What's that Beatles song? Everything's going to be all right, just don't worry. Just let it be. Don't question anything. All right, let's go on to the last quote from Wikipedia, and then we're going to move on. Okay, here's another quote. It says, writing in the New Yorker in 2014, so long after Adorno died, music critic Alex Ross argued that Adorno's work has a renewed importance in the digital age. Quote, the pop hegemony is all but complete. Its superstars dominating the media and wielding the economic might of tycoons. culture appears more monolithic than ever, with a few gigantic corporations, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, presiding over unprecedented monopolies. All right, so if Theodor Adorno wasn't such a big deal in pop music, why the heck would a music critic writing in the New Yorker say that Adorno's work has renewed importance in the digital age? Okay, so yeah, this Adorno cat is real. So people say, it's conspiracy theory. Adorno didn't write the Beatles music. Oh, I think he probably wrote a lot of them anyway. Anyway, let's move on. Okay, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, now we're going to go on to this book called Tavistock Institute, Social Engineering the Masses, by an author named Daniel Estulin, Estulin, if you're interested. So I'm just going to do some choice things here, right? And of course, there's our handsome fella, Theodor Adorno on the screen there. Okay, so it's just real quick, some choice things in this book. Okay, here it says, during World War II, Tavistock was the headquarters of the British Army's Psychological Warfare Bureau, which, through the arrangements of the Special Operations Executive, also dictated policy to the United States Armed Forces in the matters of psychological warfare. So there's your origin of the Tavistock Institute. Moving on. He says, this interlocked juggernaut of evil consists of some of the world's most prestigious centers of knowledge and research, such as Stanford Research Center at Stanford University, Rand Corporation, MIT Sloan, quote, the Advanced Center of Behavioral Sciences at Palo Alto. Palo Alto is in Northern California, near San Francisco, by the way. The Institute of Social Research at the University of Michigan, the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania. That's where Donald Trump went. The Harvard Business School, London School of Economics, the National Training Laboratories, the Hudson Institute, Esalen Institute, and there's more. It also says the first full-time Age of Aquarius graduate school charged with teaching behavior modification for high-level executives from Fortune's top 500 companies. So, what this author is putting together is that the Tavistock Institute is interlocked with these other think tanks. So your highfalutin colleges have think tanks. And the other interesting thing is, and I know this for a fact, that a lot of your high-level executives are taught the art of manipulating people in these schools. They absolutely do teach you the art of psychological manipulation in schools, especially if you want to run these companies. And if you've ever met somebody that is very good at psychological manipulation, right? Maybe we'll do a lesson on various tactics that they use. Remember, these people that are high up in these corporations, they're not smarter than you. They just were trained in the art of psychological manipulation. For example, trying to make you look stupid, make you feel stupid, things like that. All right, but let's move on. So let's go on to... Let's talk about Theodor Adorno and the Tavistock Institute here. This is later on in the book. It says, quote, if this statement seems harsh, consider the following. In his 1948 work on the philosophy of modern music, Frankfurt School leader Theodor Adorno argued that the purpose of modern music is to literally drive the listener insane. Quote, he justified this by asserting that modern society was a hotbed of evil, authoritarianism, and potential fascism, and that only by first destroying civilization through the spread of all forms of cultural pessimism and perversity could liberation occur. right? What was going on in the 60s with the music, cultural perversity, right? Sex, drugs, rock and roll, free love. And we now are dealing with the ramifications of this, especially with females that give their bodies away freely, right? They lose the ability to pair bond. Men don't want them because their bodies are too used. I'm trying to keep it clean, right? This was all promoted, that sex, drugs, and rock and roll, right? This was all promoted in the 50s and 60s. Cultural pessimism, right? The rock and roll rebel was created. Wow. Okay, let's read a little bit of this a little bit more about this. So this is Adorno again. On the role of modern music, he wrote, "It is not that schizophrenia is directly expressed therein, but the music imprints upon itself an attitude similar to that of the mentally ill. The individual brings about his own disintegration. He imagines the fulfillment of the promise through magic." Wow. Right? Doesn't music program people into a fantasy world? But nonetheless, within the realm of immediate actuality. Its concern is to dominate schizophrenic traits through the aesthetic consciousness. All right, here he is with this over-intellectualization here. But what he's basically saying is, to my understanding, the music imprints itself an attitude similar to that of the mentally ill. All right? Some of those heavy metal bands, when the guys are headbanging, doing the mosh pits, that's mentally ill behavior. Running around slamming into each other, throwing up the devil horns. There's another example of that. Okay? So this guy Adorno, man, I'm beginning to realize he's kind of perverse. But anyway, let's talk a little bit more about him in this book. And I want to read more in this book, but this is just some choice stuff. Okay, let's look at this. Both the Tavistock and Frankfurt School paid close attention to Nazi propaganda techniques, which they willingly incorporated into their research. The aim of this project, as stated in Adorno's Introduction to the Sociology of Music, was to, quote, program a mass culture as a form of extensive social control that would steadily degrade its consumers, unquote. The application of their research into human behavior was set to launch a decade later in a major irreversible cultural revolution in America. All right, that cultural revolution is referring to the 1960s, right? But he's talking about music as degrading the people that listen to the music. They're the consumers. Look at our music today with WAP by Cardi B. And I was listening to Little Jean. I think that's how you pronounce it. Just came across it. I don't listen to what the young people are listening today, so I thought I'd check it out. And how bass is that music? Right? It's like they mumble and then you hear smoke weed. Mumble, F that B. Mumble, blah, blah, blah. All completely degrading music. And if you think it doesn't have an effect, it absolutely has an effect. So parents, don't let your kids listen to this garbage. It will have an effect on their psyche. All right, page 165. Oh, you guys don't need to know the pages, but let's go to this next page here. Just about Theodor Adorno, page 165. In a 1944 report, Theodor Adorno, one of Frankfurt School's premier thinkers, postulated that media, such as radio and especially television, can be used to make people forcibly retarded. Listen to his words, quote, television aims at the synthesis of radio and film and is held up only because the interested parties have not yet reached agreement, but its consequences will be quite enormous and promise to intensify the impoverishment of aesthetic matter so drastically. 12 years later, Adorno wrote that, quote, television is a medium of undreamed psychological control. Enough said. All right, so let's go to page 166. Let's read this. This blew me away. In this part of the book, it talks about Adorno talking about the creative sissy that the artistic types, the people that write music, the people that perform music, are all, these creative types are all effeminized, all effeminate. It says here, in one of his other reflections, Adorno predicted that the, quote, creative sissy will find an important place in society, unquote. Several shows feature characters who are artistic, sensitive, and effeminate males. Quote, such images cohered with Freudian notions that artistic creativity stem from either a repressed or actual homosexual passion. These effeminate, sensitive males usually come up against the more aggressive, macho male images such as cowboys, who are uncreative. Okay, so in other words, this is a created scenario. Okay, we need to get that out of our heads. Just because a person is creative and writes songs or paints doesn't mean you have to be effeminate, but they're promoting that image and that mindset. And just because if you're a masculine guy, it doesn't mean you can't be creative and write music. This is all programming. And you see it, right? Going back to, as far as I can remember, the 60s, Mick Jagger, right, was effeminate acting when he would sing. David Bowie, Prince, Michael Jackson, and of course, one of the biggest examples today is K-pop, the new Beatles, right? Instead of the British invasion, you have the Korean or Asian invasion, which is very popular right now, right? And they're all wearing makeup and feminized, and it's amazing how what Adorno's talking about back in the late 1940s, 1950s, early 1960s is still in use today. And I've said it before, why do they want effeminate males? Because if you have effeminized males that think more like females, effeminized males are more agreeable. They don't stand up to oppression. And people are easier to control when the men are feminized. And I remember growing up, in high school, if you were in the marching band or if you were in choir and you were a guy, you were automatically seen as potentially gay or feminine. And that just doesn't have to be that way. We've been programmed to think that way. So, my question to you is, were the Beatles a boy band? I would say they were. They were created at the Tavistock Institute or by people associated with the Tavistock Institute for the design, the low-level reason to make money, and the high-level reason to bring in pop music that would feminize men, degrade people, get people into drugs, get people to be rebellious against society and their parents, all of which, free sex and love, all of which have damaged our society. Almost, I think, irreversibly. Anyway, thanks for sticking around. I know this was a long one. I'm your humble servant, Mr. Smith, and we will do more on this character Adorno and the Tavistock Institute later on. Please like and subscribe, or unlike if you didn't like it. If you want to support the channel, there's some information down below. And I hope you have a blessed next few days, and we'll see you next time. All right, take care.